Sorry for the delay, small technical issue on my and good evening and welcome to this special forum on Loring Coleman, whose wonderful watercolor paintings of New England landscapes are currently on display here at the Concord Museum. I'm Tom Putnam, the director here at the museum. It's a pleasure for me to switch roles tonight with my colleague Allison Schilling, who will serve as our moderator this evening. And let me note, as I don't believe I've done so publicly before, Allison recently received a prestigious award from the New England Museum Association, in part for the work she has done over this past year as the museum's senior program officer in producing this forum series. We've added an additional forum next week with biographer Richard Rhodes speaking on his new biography of the late E.O. Wilson. That'll be a week from tonight, Tuesday, January 18th at 7 p.m. We're so pleased to welcome back to this virtual stage Henry Adams, the Ruth Coulter Heed Professor of Art History at Case Western University. Professor Adams is the author of over 300 scholarly and popular articles, as well as 14 books or book-length exhibition catalogs. Among these are Eakins Revealed, which Andrew Wyeth described as, quote, without question, the most extraordinary biography I have ever read on an artist. When he was a high school student at Middlesex School here in Concord, Professor Adams studied under Loring Coleman, and more recently he wrote the foreword to Mr. Coleman's autobiography. In the afterword of that book, which we'll hear more about this evening, Mr. Coleman wrote, years ago when Henry was a student of mine, we learned from each other. He taught me the strength of quiet contemplation. His profound understanding of the familiar and the new enlightens us all. We're also pleased to be joined this evening by Larry Powers, who has owned and operated Powers Gallery since 1982, after taking the business over from his father. Mr. Powers is also an art consultant for This Old House, Putnam Investments, and Empower Retirement. And you can purchase some originals and beautifully crafted prints of Loring Coleman's paintings at the Powers Gallery. In his autobiography, Loring Coleman wrote, quote, Larry Powers transformed a small frame shop and gallery into a large and thriving business. He has the ability to present each work of art to its best advantage. And lastly, Hugh Fortmiller is a former teacher of English and theater and an associate head of school at the Middlesex School. He was a close friend for 55 years of Loring Coleman and the editor of Loring W. Coleman, Living and Painting in a Changing New England. Let me read these words of tribute written by Mr. Coleman about his friend. Hugh Fortmiller, my friend and editor, is a wise and caring man with a profound feeling and understanding for what I wanted for this book. He listened carefully into my recollections and had the ability to make many subtle changes which never altered the storyline, but made the work more cohesive. With a growing command of all the details, Hugh frequently would move a whole paragraph or page and place it in another section where it not only fit perfectly, but made more sense to the flow of the narrative. Always upbeat and encouraging, Hugh was a magician as he polished my drafts to make my thoughts clear to the reader. Let me close with some words that Mr. Fortmiller wrote about his friend Loring Coleman, also in the autobiography. Loring Coleman's recollections create vibrant contrasts, sunlight and shade, lights and darks, summer and winter, snow and sun, life and death, idealism and realism, motorcycles and VW wagons, dark beer and crystal clear martinis. Loring continues to fill his lifelong roles as a husband, father, churchgoer, hymn-singing baritone, friend, mentor, storyteller, and teacher as he recalls his life as a student, fisherman, marksman, photographer, set builder, prankster, victim, hero, army colonel, yodeler, mountain climber, and superb maker of moving and evocative paintings. Enough of my words, except to thank the three of you for being here this evening and allowing us to listen into your conversation about Loring Coleman, which will be led now by my colleague, Allison.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you everyone for tuning in this evening. I think only New Englanders are hardy enough to choose on the coldest night of the year to spend an hour looking at paintings of snow. So I'm very grateful that you're all here to join us to talk about the art of Loring Coleman and the teacher and man behind the paintings. We couldn't be in better hands with these three who not only have intimate knowledge of Coleman's work, but were also his very close friends. It's evident reading Coleman's autobiography and talking with people like the three of you who knew him that Coleman loved to connect with people, be them colleagues, students, or strangers, and laugh and tell stories. So I'm looking forward to hearing some of those from the three of you tonight. So if we want to just dive right in, Loren Coleman is really known in Concord because of his incredibly detailed watercolors of a disappearing New England. His legacy is equally significant as an educator teaching art for 27 years at Middlesex School. Henry, Professor Adams, you have an experience firsthand as a student of Coleman's, and Hugh, you worked closely with him at Middlesex. I'm wondering if the both of you could share some insights into Coleman as a teacher and his time at Middlesex.
Henry, do you want to begin?
Well, Loren was, how would I say, he was always one of the most popular teachers in the school, and very upbeat, and had a very sort of relaxed quality to his classes. And it was interesting, after leaving Middlesex, I didn't see him for something like 30 years. And then I went back and got to know him as an older man. And I guess I'd say that the revelation at that point was the extraordinary discipline that lay behind this seemingly very relaxed person. And I remember he gave wonderful classroom talks. It turns out that he actually wrote them all out in longhand, both forehand, that there was an extraordinary underlying discipline to him. And I know that when Monk Terry hired him at Middlesex, one of the things he insisted on was that he would have 2 days a week where he could devote it to his own painting. How would I say? I mean, I think the extraordinary discipline to work 5 days at Middlesex and then to go out and really, paint with extraordinary intensity. I guess I'd say the other paradoxical thing about him, his own work, at least superficially, seems very straightforwardly realistic, but he was the first person who made me think that I should look closely at Jackson Pollock. And if you look closely at his paintings, there's a marvelous mastery of abstract design.
I should add, Henry, that he took a group of students to a Pollock exhibit in Boston. And on the way home in the van, the kids were talking about, well, the classic Pollock reaction. Well, anybody can do that. So Loring went down to the Concord Lumber Company and got some 4x8 sheets of I guess composition board or wall board. He put them on the floor in a large hallway, gave each kid about 6 different cans of paint and said, go to it. And they did for about an hour, and they came back later and finished it. And the thing that was remarkable that they saw immediately was that the kids who were the very best painters of realistic paintings and drawings in studio art were the ones that did the best Pollock imitations. They knew a sense of composition and color and shape. And he used that as a way of demonstrating how one should be thinking as an artist. It's interesting that you bring that up because he is not thought to be at all an abstract painter. And yet there he was doing just his class. Yeah, quite something. My experience with him, just briefly, I got to know him right out of college and when I started teaching there, and and because I was involved with theater, he had to do a lot of other things as head of the art department. He had to paint sets. He had to design sets. We would spend all night painting it together. He'd do the detail work. I'd do the messy stuff. But he also had to supervise plaque carving. Every student was required to produce a carving of a plaque that went into the walls of the school permanently. And he took great pleasure in the craft of carving, and he taught it extremely well. Obviously, making sure the designs wouldn't embarrass the student 40 years later when they came back with their grandchildren.
And I think even Coleman had these, extracurriculars at Middlesex and painting sets. He did do a wonderful job with some of them too. And like you said, Hugh, he took a lot of attention to the work with the plaques. And in his autobiography, I read that he was assigned to paint the squash courts. And so he canceled all of his classes for 3 days to meticulously paint the squash courts with the red lines. So it seems that, I don't know how he felt about these assignments, but he took them with gusto.
But Loring was in the Army, and in the Army, he was an illustrator. So he was painting things for posters for training soldiers. So his background goes back to, illustrative work. And so that wasn't new to him to do illustrative work, and nor was it below him. He was a very smart guy, and he worked all through the Army. That was his job, was to do illustrations and posters and training for. So I'm not surprised to hear that he was doing set design and didn't mind it.
Well, I might say his set designs were impressive because he had an amazing ability with perspective effects and to make things where if you were up close to them, they looked fairly loosely painted, but when you were back in the audience, they looked, just completely real and completely three-dimensional, often when they were just a painting.
Yeah. When he went into the Army, he got married the day before Pearl Harbor. Yes. And he went into the Army soon thereafter. And apparently the person who was inducting him said, well, what do you do for a living? And he said, well, I'm an artist. I'm a painter. Well, he went through the catalog and he couldn't find art or artist. So he looked under painter, and Loring's initial job was as a house painter in the Army. But he ended up head of the largest Army art center in the world during World War II down in Georgia.
Right.
He was in command, as you said, Larry, of some extraordinary illustrators from New York who are working in, Saturday Evening Post and other such amazing illustrators. But that was his command. Quite an interesting. I would say, Henry, that also one of the reasons he did everything in longhand was that he was dyslexic, and he was very worried that his lectures would not be clear, but he wrote very precisely and very carefully.
He was very detail oriented in every way, even in his paintings.
Yeah, so Coleman has really had tremendous impact on so many people, like Henry, as an educator, and I hope that continues to crop up as we talk tonight. But I do want to shift a little bit, talk about Coleman really as an artist. And Larry, you have really worked so closely with him and his artwork. I hope you can tell us a little bit about what it was like to work with him and frame his artwork in your gallery.
Well, my dad started it, and they had a nice tight collaboration, and my dad was a brilliant man and a very expert craftsman and designer. And then I slid in and worked with him. But to work with Loring was an amazing experience because Loring would come in and you're seeing paintings that are just fresh off the easel. I mean, they are just brand new. And to work with him, you would get the whole story of the painting and he would describe it to you. So he would pause and just describe what he had just painted. So I'm the first one to really get a full insight into the paintings, and they were all extraordinary. And we got to see every one. And he really valued how a frame affected a painting, and he got it. And working with him, it was a total collaboration. And he would come in and he'd say, okay, what do you think we should do? And I think I'd like to do a fabric mat. And then the wheels start turning. And then it was just a whole creative process. But I felt honored to be, and my dad too, to be included in the decision-making of how things were framed. And when you see the exhibit, you get to see how perfectly the frames worked with the artwork, but it was Loring, and it was just a whole process. And Evelyn, who works with me, started on helping out. And it was just such a treat to work with them. But to get the stories from the paintings fresh off the easel was extraordinary. And I have to tell one quick story. Loring would come in with his van, and he came in mud season. It was springtime. He had just finished a major painting, and I can't remember which one it was, but it was big. So big that he opened up his van and he came in to get me to help him bring the painting in because it was all stapled or tacked to a sheet of plywood. So we go out to get the painting. It's a two-person job to bring it in. It was so big. And we realized that our dog Blinky, after walking through the mud, walked across the painting with muddy paws. And it was, you can imagine the horror for me. And Loring he took it and he just laughed and he said, he thought it was the funniest thing to happen. And he said, I'm horrified and I'm ready to just like, I don't know. I was just devastated. And he said, don't worry about it. I can fix it. And he said, we designed the frame for it. And he said, I'll take the painting. He took it back and he worked it and he worked the watercolors so that when he was done, you could not tell Blinky with wet paws walked across the painting. And that's the kind of guy Loring was, though. He was such a gentleman. You know, a typical artist with a dog with wet paws, they would freak out, I would think, and it would be just a horrible moment. But he made it into a moment that was not horrible, and it was a special moment. And I'll always remember that was an event that could have been gone one way, and Loring, being Loring, brought it the other way, being a total gentleman and a professional and knowing what he did. And then it was a joke from then on. Every time he brought it in, that was a permanent joke, get your dog out of here. And the other thing is, I said, Loring, next time I saw him, Loring, we tortured the dog. And he had a dark sense of humor too. He loved that. I said, we tortured the dog, so don't worry, it's been taken care of, which we didn't.
Something that struck me in reading the autobiography was how closely linked family is to Coleman's art. It's not immediately evident in the paintings that are almost entirely devoid of human subjects, but many of his paintings outside of New England came from travels with his wife, Katinka, and she's frequently mentioned in the autobiography having, visiting him at the sites where he's painting, and she conjured a ghost story at one of the particularly bedraggled houses where Coleman was working. His son was the one who first saw the farm that became the subject of Home, which is the namesake painting for our exhibit. So the three of you were such close friends with him. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about Coleman, the husband, father, how that played a role in his life and his artwork.
I I came to know Tinka extremely well, and the four children. Taught Peter, the eldest. What strikes me about the way in which he worked and was that he loved to work outdoors. He worked, as Larry said, he had a VW van. He took all of the seats out in the back, and he would sit in the van with the side door wide open. And so he could paint even in snowy or rainy weather, sitting with an easel propped up in the van. And his stories frequently have to do with people who watched him while he was painting. He has a lovely story about doing a painting in the van when a bunch of kids walked by, and he was painting icicles that were hanging from the edge of a roof. And so it was really a sparkling, I mean, he loved winter and he loved ice and snow far more than springtime. Those colors didn't interest him, but he would even in the spring decide to change the landscape to winter because he didn't like the greens. And he would pick the leaves off the trees. But a group of kids watching him and stopping, and their eyes wide open as he was working on this beautiful painting of icicles in the side of a house. And he turned to a young girl who was there and he said, "Do you like it?" And she said, "Yes, I like it." Well, what do you think about it? Well, I think it's so beautiful that it must have been painted by somebody else. That was the comment. He recorded that, he wrote it down, and he loved that. Beautiful. It must have been painted by somebody else. Home is an interesting story. I don't know whether you want to show that or not.
Yeah, I can pull that up now.
Larry has some thoughts about it too, but as I recall, Home, Andrew told him about this cluster of houses, and he went to Sterling, I believe it is, to see them. And he knocked on the doors. He loved the arrangement of these buildings. No one was there. And he started making a pencil sketch of this scene. He didn't put in all the details of the stone wall. That diagonal stone wall is something that you see in many of his paintings. He was intrigued by the four windows that are in the peak of the barn. He found those so unusual. And he worked on the sketch in pencil for 10 days and never saw anyone, never saw a soul. He took it home and put it in the bottom of a cabinet drawer, put a protective paper across it, and then forgot about it for 20 years. He pulled the sketch out. He said, "What in the world is this?" And he remembered. And that's when he painted what you see. And the classic Loring detail, there's no person there, but there's a dog. And notice that he puts lights in the window of the shed and the barn. There's always a sense of humanity present, even though you don't see the figures. It's a lovely painting.
Yes. Larry, do you want to share your thoughts on the painting?
I'd love to, because Loring made the print of it, which is extraordinary. And it's my favorite of all his prints that he made. I just love it. And he brought me a photograph, and it was the house, just a house. All the outbuildings, the barn and the outbuildings and the shed are gone. And the thing that I find fascinating and appreciate Loring for is that he was capturing New England farms and properties. And I was speaking with Evelyn, who works with me, about it, that Concord was farmland. You go through the Concord Museum and you realize that it was all farms, and what Loring was doing was capturing the essence of the New England farm and the way of life, and you've got oil drums there, and he always had a critter in his paintings, but he captured the essence of a farm, and a lot of his farms were in decay, and those outbuildings are gone. The house is still there, but that was the thing that I appreciate about Loring, and he captured New England in a which is slowly, I live on a development that was a farm, and he captured it and he froze it in time, and we can appreciate what he's done. And you look at all his paintings, and a lot of them are barns, and as Hugh said, there's humanity. He did painting called Farm Boy, and it was a beautiful barn and a farm boy standing in a doorway. And another one, we grew up next to a dairy farm, Norman Livermore, and he painted a portrait of the house with Norman standing in the doorway. It was called Norman at Home. So he breathed life into these paintings, and they all tell a story.
Now, Professor Adams, I think you speak and have written very well about how, a disappearing New England, decrepit barns could seem trite, but the way Coleman handles them is so authentic and fresh. Wonder if
Yeah,
you could
he
talk about
gets
that.
a great feeling. And I also think, I mean, he's such an interesting figure because of sort of contrasts you wouldn't expect. He is, in a person, he was very optimistic, very upbeat, very positive. But in his paintings, there's this extraordinary sense of decay and the passage of time. I don't know, it's interesting, but maybe a sort of underlying optimism in the idea that you're preserving something that might otherwise be lost.
Yeah, even like you mentioned, the lights coming from the barns and the shed, it's falling apart, but there's still some life in there. The details are wonderful.
Well, and I might say that one of the details of Loring's life that I never knew as a student, but is kind of amusing. He actually grew up in Chicago, but he would see New England when he visited his grandmother. But in Chicago as a little boy, he was shopping in a store when Al Capone came up in the elevator. That's certainly something I never knew as a student studying with him, that he had met Al Capone. So quite a life.
Yeah.
Well, here,
Wonderful things in this painting. I mean, notice, for example, how the white snow of the roof blends with the sky, and the wonderful quality of the flying bird flying by the chimney of the house. And also, the weather vane on the barn is just beautifully painted. Wonderfully.
He has a crow or two in many of his paintings. They are one. Yeah.
Well, and you've got to feel that these animals, sometimes it's a dog, sometimes it's a fox, but in some way they're almost a surrogate for Loring himself, I think, who is kind of wandering, looking around.
Can I tell a real quick story?
Yeah.
Speaking of critters, Loring brought me in a painting. It was an ancient doorway, and it was somewhere in Europe, but it was a door that he found incredibly captivating. And it was an amazing painting, and it was the perfect detail of the door and the chipped paint. But at the bottom of it was a rat. And he gave it to me to sell. And it was an extraordinary painting. And he said, yeah, I'd like you to sell this. And I said, well, Loring, it's going to be kind of hard to sell the painting with a rat. And he says, that's not just any rat. That's a bubonic plague rat. And I said, oh, that's even better, Loring. You know, it's got a bubonic plague rat. And I said, all right, we'll sell it, but it's not going to be easy. I said, Loring, could you make it a bunny rabbit, you know, with a fluffy tail? And Joey goes, no, absolutely not. You know, he laughed and said, no. And we did sell it. And we sold it to a gentleman that loved the painting. He had a 10-year-old daughter, and his daughter said, but Daddy, it has a rat in it. And he goes, that's not any rat. That's a bubonic plague rat. And I love it. It's in his book, by the way.
That's great.
But that's one of his critters.
Well, here's another, this one is New England Classic. It's also up in the exhibit we have at the museum right now. Another barn and snow, and we have another critter here as well. I'm wondering if someone might want to talk a little bit about his process, finding these barns, finding these locations, what drew him to certain places.
Well, he drove around a great deal to find sites like this, and he depended on others to tell him about particularly farms and farm outbuildings that were decaying, and he wanted to preserve them in the images to somehow keep them alive, knowing that they were going to fall down in time. And Henry is getting at an interesting dichotomy between the beautiful, but also the decaying, the dying. This painting is in Groton, and he calls it New England Classic. He identifies it that is the home of a woman that he came to know, Helen Gay, in Groton, and he said that Helen and her daughter would come out every day to watch him paint. But he then said, in my mind, he said, the German Shepherd from quite another farmyard seemed like an appropriate visitor. So he kind of takes this shepherd dog that really doesn't belong to this house at all, but he feels it adds that sense of a warm living presence that he wanted to put here. And at the same time, you see that there is a light in the window, a presence there as well.
The thing about Loring, his paintings is, and I had the same experience with Wyeth. I saw millions of prints of Wyeth, and I was kind of bored to tears with them after seeing so many. But we went to the Brandywine Museum, and I saw a Wyeth in person, and it was like a slap on the face. It was an aha moment. It was like, oh, this is why. And when you see him in person, it's just an eye opener. It's an aha moment. And the same thing with Loring's work. You see a print of it here and you love it and it's beautiful. But man, when you go to the museum and you see this in person, it's just mind blowing. So I encourage people to see the show because it is truly amazing.
Yeah, when we prepare for the exhibit, we don't really get to see the painting. So we're working off of these like little tiny computer pictures that show us what will be in the exhibit. And like I can tell you how blown away I was when I finally got to see them on the wall. Like it's unbelievable to be in the presence with them, just the scale, the detail, and being in a room just full of them is really special.
Henry O often look at this kind of work, and am I right to see that somehow this is a watercolor, and yet he was trained as an oil painter, and I see the way in which the trees in the foreground are just solid and sharp. And yet they overlay the detail of that barn. And I'm wondering, how in God's name do you do this in a watercolor?
Yeah, I think this is an amazing painting, and he's very expert the way he's using watercolor for things like the tree in a way that is almost opaque, that has the feeling of an oil painting, and then other places where he's using very thin washes. And actually, I mean, if you look at something like the road, it's interesting how he's letting his technique free up a little bit. And we're sort of unconscious of these things, but it's the fact that there are these looser areas that make the detail seem so sharp.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing.
He always got in, he really enjoyed and really got involved with the wood and like in the building and the windows and the details of the windows, and like on the barn, the end of the barn, the colors, the way the colors of wood that's just aging, he really got involved with it. And then the facade with the kind of a blue gray, and the colors and the way the paints varied. He really, really enjoyed doing that in high detail. And as Henry says, pushing the medium watercolor as far as anybody can for detail and opaqueness, and then breaking away and loosening up. But he loved the high detail.
Well, and it's interesting how he gives a kind of personality to the building with the cupola. It has a sort of sense of pride, even magnificence, but then it's represented in a kind of crumbling state. And it's a building with real personality to it.
Yeah, here I have, I'll bring us to a little warmer painting here.
Yeah.
But I like the discussion that we were just having about the handling of watercolor. It really is so impressive and special, and Coleman really found watercolor, you know, after his training and stuck to it and really mastered it. It's quite exceptional. I'd be interested to hear from Larry about what it was like working with those watercolors, and it sounds like it might have been maybe more of a collaborative experience, being able to really play with a work on paper and choose mats and frames for Coleman.
Well, a painting like this, you look at it and there's so much going on. I mean, it's a really complex painting and brilliantly done. And there's so much going on that it requires a wide, generous mat so that the viewer focuses on the painting, and the mat just gives it a quiet space around it. And as I say, the painting is so much going on that you need to separate the frame so it's not sitting right on the painting. And you can really zoom in on the painting and take it all in, because there's so much to see. And it is such a dichotomy of the trucks, rusting trucks and tires. And then you've got this beautiful nature setting. And there's the spring green that he hated, and which I loved. And I always teased him about it, you know, but he hated the spring green, as Hugh said. But it's an amazing composition. And then the way it fades into the background. But as far as framing goes, yeah, it was a discussion of, yeah, we need to give this room to breathe. And, you know, probably had a 5-inch mat. I don't know. I can't see zooming out what the frame was, but I imagine it was a pretty generous mat.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting that there's the mud scene in the foreground, and the muddy, grassy spring color. But look what the upper half is. It's fall. There are no leaves on those trees. He's using a mist. He's using fall colors. He's almost having some difficulty, it seems to me, coping with the fact that it's spring, for God's sake.
he hated the spring greens. I mean, we had jokes about it. And I joked with him because I loved summer and hot weather, and he hated it, and he loved winter and cold weather. And it'd be a hot summer day, and I go, "Hey, Loring, isn't this great? It's nice and hot." And he goes, "I hate it." He'd come in on a winter day, and he goes, "Larry, isn't this great? It's freezing out."
Here
But
I
look at
have,
the colors in the trucks. I mean, there's so much to see here. The way he played with the rusty trucks, and there's 18 colors in each truck. It's amazing.
He used to keep sketches of things like these trucks. And I have a G. Clay print of his, and he tells the story of painting it and having the daughter of the farmer who owned this land look at it. Loring had needed to put something in to the composition, and he chose a truck like this. He pulled out an old sketch and put a truck in. Well, the farmer looked at the painting and said, "Oh my God," he said, "I thought I hauled that truck out 15 years ago." So it's fascinating to see these vehicles. And every once in a while, particularly late in his life when he was no longer working outdoors, he would pick out sketches, a truck, a wall, something that inspired him, and he would create a composition from those sketches.
And he said he earned, after a long career, he said, "I've earned the right to make a composition, even though it's not literal." He felt that it was okay. And Hugh, the truck that was in the painting was an army truck. And it was a distinctive army truck. And the farmer said, "How did you know I had an army truck?" It's a true story too. Amazing.
I wanted to show this picture of
Mm.
Coleman in his van, and maybe talk a little bit about him on site. So we kind of call him a plein air painter, and you've all talked about him being out painting and people coming up to him. I'm wondering, like, how much of his process was really done outside at these places. I mean, these are big, intensive paintings. Like, was he out there doing all the details? How much of his work was sketches done back in the studio? I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about his process. And I liked this picture of him. It's fun.
A great shot.
My understanding is that he liked to do as much as he possibly could do on site. He really didn't enjoy working in his studio. But as you know, his eyesight was beginning to fail later in life. And he was depending, particularly when he went to Austria, where they were traveling, Tinka and he began to depend more and more on his camera. He had spent the early part of his life, Henry, when he taught you art history, using slides that he had made. He had not bought them from museums. They weren't around. He had to go to Europe, to Egypt, to France, to Greece, and brought these slides back to show to you. Well, late in life, he used photographs and older sketches to try to compose, but that was the last, say, 5 to 8 years of his painting, I'd say. Most of it was just what you see.
And
Frankly, one of the things that fascinates me is it's pretty hard to tell what he did outdoors and what he did in the studio. And a good example would be that painting Home, where he did the pencil drawing outside and all the painting was done in the studio, presumably without much of a reference. He just knew how the sky looks and how the light falls. And, it's kind of fascinating mental thing.
But he did love painting on site. And
Yeah.
we lived next to a dairy farm, and that's how we first got to know him. And he was intensely painting on site. He'd have his easel with a piece of plywood, right, what you see there. And because that way he captured the essence of the piece. And this was when he was able to do it. He just loved being on site and painting. And then as the years went by, he would start to do more and more in his studio. But I think he really lived to do plein air, which was on site. And the way we met him was my brother came in. He was 10 years old. He goes, "Dad, there's an artist painting next door." And my father said, "Well, leave him alone. Don't bother him." And the next thing you know is Loring's at the door. He says, "Oh, your son said you do framing." And that's how they got to know each other. That was Norman at home in Norman's farm. And he did a number of paintings, like the bathtub hue.
Yeah.
Centerpiece.
Goat bathtub where the goats drank their water. Turned to Norman Livermore's and other farms that he loved and simply change his perspective and choose a different composition and go back again and again.
Yep.
But one of the things that made him a plein air painter, as I recall, is that early on when he was a teenager and he started studying with very good teachers, particularly during the summer, they were all oil painters. And they would go to Vermont with a small group of people, and he would sit in the field, and he was learning his oil paintings, painting all outdoors, with the teacher coming around and critiquing it. And so he was used to teaching outdoors as well. He loved taking a group of people with their easels and their palettes, whether they were oil or watercolor painters, and get to a landscape situation and let them set up their easels and go to it. He loved that.
Well, of course, one of the fascinating things is what was the drive that impelled him to do this? And, certainly by the end of his life, he was getting good prices for his painting. But if you calculated the number of hours he put into it, he was probably making about 50 or 25 cents an hour. But that clearly wasn't why he was doing it. There was some need that was being fulfilled. I think that's sort of one of the fascinating aspects of it.
Yeah.
How long did it typically take him to do a work? I mean, Larry, like how often was he coming in with a fresh painting to see you?
It would be a long time. You wouldn't see him for, a month or two, and then he'd show up with a massive masterpiece. And he loved to, painting was oxygen to Loring. I mean, that was his love. And as Henry says, it wasn't about the money. It was, that was his life, and he lived to paint.
Well,
And
I think
he would
that painting home, that it took him 10 hours just to do the drawing, and the drawing wasn't even quite finished. He hadn't gotten to the stone wall. So, I mean, that's a lot of time to spend making a drawing. And you've got to be kind of obsessive about what you're doing to put that kind of effort into it.
just the drawing, and then it gets to the paint and painting every little nail head, every chip of paint.
Yeah.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
Apparently, he as he describes it, he did a lot of work in pencil as he sketched something out. And early on, he was doing just oils, but he liked to do sketches for his oils in watercolor. So we would make a watercolor sketch and then blow up the scale and produce a large oil from that. But the more he did that exercise, the more he looked at the watercolors and said, wait a minute, I don't need to make a large oil painting from this. This is good. This is enough. And he made that transition from oil to watercolor without an awful lot of watercolor formal training. And I think you see that influence in his watercolors.
He was an honest painter, totally honest painter. And I know watercolors have certain techniques that you might say, trickery or just techniques. But Loring just attacked it head on. And he knew how to manipulate the paint and paint with a fine brush and get high detail. And I think that's what set him apart from a lot of watercolorists. And a lot of watercolorists strive to paint like Loring. They would, try to get that technique, and his draftsmanship was extraordinary. All of his angles and his drafting were extraordinary.
Right here. I don't think we have a bubonic plague rat on this door, but this is from one of his travels. Oh.
That's a painting that he did in Norway on a trip in 2004 with Tinka. And apparently they were on a cruise ship and they walked up into this town and he saw this door. He made a quick pencil sketch, and then he took his camera and took close-up detail of all of that work and the handle and the knocker and all of the details he carried home with him as photographs. And between his sketch and the photographs, he did this painting at home in the studio.
Yeah, it's beautiful. We think of him as such a hometown painter, all these New England landscapes, but he really did such a beautiful job in his travels and finding new places to explore.
That was another dimension to his painting, were his paintings of Austria. I mean, he did some major paintings of Austrian farms, and there was one huge, the one with the cow manure splashed on the side of the building. Remember that one?
Yeah.
He would pick subject matter. Sometimes, like this one here is fascinating, and it's just a study of a door, but the detail but the other one was just a barnyard scene, but it was a corner of a building, and there was just all this manure splashed on this side. But it was an extraordinary painting.
Well, he saw it as a painting within a painting.
Yeah.
And, let it go. Yeah, your story about the dog's prints. He once did a painting of the door of his house in Sudbury. And he had it on an easel, he had it finished. His kids had a party, and somebody among the kids came in and took a red brush full of paint and spattered this finished work. And everybody was horrified. Loring took that red splash, it's like the manure on the side of the barn, and he turned it into something graceful and beautiful and a patina that he believes led the painting to win the first prize in the Boston Art Festival.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing.
I love that.
That says something about Loring just as a person. He was just such a gentleman, caring, just a wonderful guy with a wonderful sense of humor, and so thoughtful that, he was just an amazing guy, gentleman, and everybody loved him, understandably.
So here, this is the last slide. that I have for us to look at. And Larry claimed his favorite was home. I'll say this one is my favorite. Just think it's so wonderfully expressive, and it gets at what Professor Adams was talking about with abstraction, like the disappearing barn and then the tendrils of those branches coming through. I feel like here he was really starting to play and let it get beyond that highly representational work. I love looking at this painting. And my last comment on it is that it's just so bold. I think he takes some like opaque white paint and just splatters it over the finished work. You can see it when you're in the museum. I just can't imagine the hours and hours that went into painting this, and then to be so bold to splatter gouache on top of it. It's a big move.
I do think this is fascinating because you think of Loring's work, a lot of it is sort of hard and realistic, but this is amazing the way the house seems to just fade away into the mist.
Mm-hmm.
He calls this spectral barn, and he describes the day, while he was there, the weather was deteriorating. And this barn disappeared in his presence as he sketched this out. It really is one of my very favorite paintings. It's very evocative. It pulls you in. And notice the beautiful, warm lights in the windows with the sleet coming down.
Well, there are some interesting visual games there because look at the contrast between the lighted window and the black window. It's all very ingenious as a kind of abstract composition.
Yeah. Henry, I noticed a recurrence of that diagonal, whether it's a road or a wall.
Yeah.
He loves that. Brings you into the painting in a way, or you travel in. And the depth of it.
He would talk a lot about composition and angles and things that draw you in, and that's all intentional.
Yeah.
He really focused on these angles and what draws you into a painting. But I'm with you, Allison. This is a strong painting. I love it. And
Yeah, I like this one a lot. Okay,
One of the things I was trying to do, Allison, when you gave us these slides, he has the crow in the upper right quadrant, and I tried to blow it up because it seems to me that disappearing with the barn is a crow in the center left that's just disappearing. It looks like a little smudge.
yeah, you can, like on the right side, there's one that's more in the foreground and visible, and then you fade back and there's that smaller one disappearing
It's
in
tiny.
the back. It's nice.
Yeah.
this painting is so atmospheric. I mean, you can feel it.
Yeah.
Well, we are really running almost out of time. I would love to hear just some final thoughts from the three of you who knew Coleman so well and knew his art. Anyone who wants to go first, go ahead, and they can be short.
The thing that impresses me about Loring and his life is while he was still painting in his early 90s, suddenly he lost his eyesight. I thought about if I had been the painter that he was, suddenly losing eyesight, I think I would have said, that's it. But that's when he decided to return to look at all his paintings, look at them because he knew them, and put together that biography in which he writes about so many of his paintings. I thought that took tremendous courage, and he did it with great humor and insight. Yeah, I love the guy. I really did.
Well, that was a big thing for him. And as you say, losing the ability to paint is devastating. And thanks to you being at his side, that gave him a whole new purpose, and it gave him a second, life. And I give you credit, Hugh, for being by his side and really working with him. And that brought him through the final, time of living here, but so purposeful. And he loved you, and you guys collaborated and did an extraordinary job. So kudos.
Thanks, Larry. And bringing Henry in to write the introduction was a great tribute as well, having him collaborate. And you can imagine, Larry, how, as I approach 90, I'm in my late 80s, I think about him and how he dealt with his life. And I wish I could do as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say, he just was a very inspiring character. And I mean, even, for people who took his art classes who ended up doing nothing with art, there's something about just being around a guy like that gives you a sense of motivation and purpose, which I think is what teaching is really all about.
Well, thank you so much to the three of you. It really brings a whole nother dimension to getting to see these paintings at the museum. And I hope many of the people watching tonight will stop by and see the paintings in person, because it really is exceptional to be with them in the museum. So thank you all for such a great night. And thank you everyone for watching.
Yeah, thank you, Allison, and thank you, Lawrence, and you. Yeah,
Thank you, guys.
it's been fun.
Yeah.
Great.